The words hung in the air like smoke from a burnt dish. My son Michael, dressed in his tailored chef's whites with his TV-ready smile, had just served me the coldest dish of my life. "You're nothing but a burden, Dad. Just an old man living off my success." The private dining room of the Golden Spoon, my first restaurant, now his flagship, fell silent. 20 family members and executives froze mid-bite. My grandson Tommy dropped his fork. The clatter against fine china echoed through the stunned silence. I looked down at my plate. Wild mushroom risotto, my recipe, though Michael had added some fancy truffle oil and called it a modern interpretation. Like everything else in my life, he'd taken it and made it better. 43 years of cooking had taught me timing is everything. So I waited, dabbed my napkin to my lips, and stood slowly. My old chef's hands, scared from decades of burns and cuts, steadied me against the table. "Thank you for dinner, Michael. The risotto needs more stock and less ego, but I'm sure your TV audience won't notice." Then I walked out, leaving my son to stew in his own bitter sauce. The valet brought my old Mercedes, not as flashy as Michael's Ferrari, but paid for with honest work. As I drove through the city's restaurant district, I passed 5 establishments bearing the Golden brand: Golden Bistro, Golden Grill, Golden Fusion, all built on my original recipes, my decades of experience. All now run by my son, who turned good food into good television. At home, the same modest house where I'd raised Michael and his sister Sarah, I went straight to my study. Behind a false panel in my old roll-top desk sat a leather-bound book, my real recipe collection. Not the simplified versions we used in the restaurants, but the true recipes, perfected over decades. The secret techniques, the exact measurements, the precise timing that had earned our first Michelin star. Michael had been asking for this book for years. "Come on, Dad, I need to document everything properly for the brand." But I'd seen how he changed things, making dishes more Instagram-worthy, but less soulful. Some things weren't meant to be modernized. My phone buzzed, Sarah calling. Unlike her brother, she'd chosen a different path, becoming a teacher instead of a chef. "Dad, are you okay? Tommy told me what happened." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Your brother's just forgotten where he came from. He's impossible lately, ever since that Netflix deal. Dad, he's talking about buying you out of your shares. Says it's time for full creative control." I glanced at the recipe book. Is he now? He has some investors lined up. They're planning to turn the Golden Spoon into a national chain. The thought of my carefully crafted dishes being mass-produced in strip malls made my stomach turn. What about the quality? The training? Michael says they'll streamline the recipes, make them easier to replicate. I thought of my father, who taught me to cook in his small Italian restaurant. Of the years spent perfecting each dish, understanding how ingredients work together, learning to cook not just with recipes but with instinct and love. "Dad, are you still there?" "Yes, sorry. Just remembering something your grandfather used to say. In cooking, as in life, you get out what you put in." After hanging up, I opened the recipe book. Each page contained not just ingredients and methods, but stories. The seafood stew I created the night Michael was born, the chocolate torte that won us our first award, the secret to our famous herb-crusted rack of lamb, a technique I discovered by accident and refined over 20 years. These weren't just recipes, they were my legacy, and Michael wanted to turn them into fast casual dining experiences. The next morning, I visited my old friend Frank, who'd been my attorney since I opened the first restaurant. "He can't force you out," Frank said, reviewing the contracts. "You still own 40% of the company, plus all the original recipes are legally your intellectual property." What about the variations they're using now? Michael's changes are significant enough to be considered new recipes, but the base techniques and proportions are still yours. Without your original recipes, documented and proven to predate the company's formation, they'd have nothing. I thought about the leather book in my desk. And if I were to withdraw permission to use my recipes? Frank leaned back, understanding dawning. They'd have to completely recreate every signature dish, given the brand's reputation is built on those recipes. The empire would crumble like an overcooked souffle. You wouldn't really do that to your own son, would you? I'd remembered Michael's words, nothing but a burden. I remembered how he'd changed our family recipes without consulting me, how he gradually pushed me out of kitchen decisions, how he turned cooking from an art into a business plan. Sometimes, I said, children need to learn the hard way about respecting their heritage. The next few days brought a flurry of calls from Michael's lawyers, from potential investors, from restaurant industry people who'd heard rumors of trouble in the Golden Empire. I answered none of them. Instead, I spent time in my home kitchen, cooking the old recipes. Simple dishes made with care and attention. No truffle oil, no fancy plating, just good food that told a story. Sarah and Tommy came over for dinner. As we ate, Tommy asked about the dishes, showing the same curiosity Michael had once had. "Grandpa, how do you make the sauce so smooth?" "That's a family secret," I winked. "One your father used to know before he decided television cameras were more important than tradition." A week after the Sunday dinner incident, Michael finally showed up at my door. He'd lost the TV smile, but his expensive suit and carefully styled hair showed he was still playing a role. "Dad, we need to talk business." "No, Michael. We needed to talk family, but you chose business instead." He followed me into the kitchen, where I was preparing a simple marinara sauce, the first recipe my father had taught me. "The investors are ready to move forward," he said. "We're prepared to offer you a very generous buyout package." I stirred the sauce, noting how he said "we" instead of "I." "Do you remember learning to make this sauce?" I asked instead of responding. "You were 6, couldn't reach the stove without standing on a chair." "Dad, please. This is important. The brand needs to evolve." "The brand?" I tasted the sauce. It needed more basil. "You mean your father's life work? The recipes your grandfather taught me, the techniques I spent decades perfecting, which are now outdated. People want modern fusion, Instagram-worthy presentations. They want entertainment with their food." I added basil fresh from my garden. What they want is good food, made with care and respect, not microwaved copies of copies. "We're not going to microwave." He stopped, frustrated. "Look, the offer is more than fair. You can retire comfortably." "I'm already comfortable, son. When I'm not as ready to watch you turn my recipes into fast food." His face hardened. "Those recipes belong to the company now." "No," I said quietly. "They belong to me. Always have. The company only has permission to use them. Permission I can revoke." The color drained from his face. "You wouldn't. You called me a burden, Michael. Said I was living off your success. Maybe it's time we saw whose success it really is." The investors are expecting to buy something that isn't for sale. My heritage isn't a commodity, son. Neither is my respect." He left angry, but I saw something else in his eyes. Fear. He knew that without my recipes, without my techniques, his golden empire was built on sand. That evening I called Sarah. "How would you like to learn some old family recipes? Really learn them, the way your grandfather taught me." "Dad, are you sure? Those are your secrets." "No, sweetheart. They're family secrets. And it's time they were passed down to someone who understands their value." The media storm hit faster than a kitchen fire. Golden Empire in crisis. Founder threatens to withdraw signature recipes, screamed the industry headlines. Food blogs buzzed with speculation of the family drama behind the restaurant chain's success. Michael appeared on morning shows, painting himself as an innovator held back by outdated traditions. "We need to evolve," he told a sympathetic host. The modern dining scene demands innovation. What he didn't mention was how those outdated traditions had built his empire. I spent my days teaching Sarah and Tommy the real recipes. My kitchen became a classroom, just as my father's had been for me. The secret, I told Tommy as he learned to make our signature pasta sauce, isn't in the ingredients. It's in understanding why each step matters. Sarah watched her son's careful attention to detail, so different from Michael's rush to change everything. He reminds me of you, Dad. The way you used to spend hours getting things exactly right. The investors were getting nervous. Frank kept me updated on the corporate side of things. Without guaranteed access to the original recipes, the national expansion plans were stalling. 2 major investment groups had already pulled out. Michael's trying to recreate the recipes from memory, Frank reported. But apparently the test kitchen results aren't matching up. Of course they weren't. My recipes weren't just lists of ingredients. They were 4 decades of small adjustments, tiny timing changes, the kind of knowledge that comes from making a dish thousands of times. One evening, Michael's wife Patricia arrived unannounced. She'd always been more interested in the social aspects of the restaurant business than the cooking. "This is ridiculous," she declared, standing in my kitchen in her designer outfit. "Do you know how much money you're costing us? The lifestyle we could have." Lifestyle. I gestured to my well-worn but immaculate kitchen. "This is my lifestyle, Patricia. Real cooking, real food, real family. It's just cooking. Michael can hire any chef to make those dishes." I pulled out an old photo album. "See this? Opening night at the first Golden Spoon. Michael was 10. He spent the whole evening running between tables, proud as could be, telling everyone his father was the chef. Ancient history," she sniffed. "We're talking about the future, about building something bigger. Bigger isn't always better." Something Michael used to understand. After she left, I called my old friend Marco, who owned a small Italian restaurant downtown. "How's that apprenticeship program we talked about?" "Ready whenever you are. My kitchen could use some fresh blood, someone willing to learn the old ways." Tommy had been spending every free moment in my kitchen, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. At 13, he showed more respect for cooking traditions than his father ever had. The next blow came when one of Michael's corporate chefs quit publicly, stating he couldn't replicate the magic of the original recipes. 3 more followed within days. Michael finally cracked when the first quarter earnings showed a 15% drop. He arrived at my house late one evening, looking less like a TV celebrity chef and more like the boy who used to beg for cooking lessons. "The board is threatening to remove me as CEO," he admitted, slumping at my kitchen table. "Without the original recipes, they say the brand has no value." I was making gnocchi, the way my father had taught me. The rhythmic motion of rolling the dough was soothing. "Do you remember why we called it the Golden Spoon?" I asked. He looked up, surprised. It was Grandpa's old spoon, the one he brought from Italy. "Yes, not gold-plated, not fancy. Just a well-used wooden spoon that had stirred 1,000 meals made with love. That's what I wanted our restaurants to be, places where food was cooked with history and heart." "Dad." "But you wanted more. Bigger, fancier, more profitable. You forgot that good food comes from the soul, not the wallet." He watched me shape the gnocchi, each piece uniformed from decades of practice. I thought I was making things better, modernizing. "You can't modernize passion, son. You can't franchise love." The silence stretched between us, filled with the scent of fresh pasta and unspoken words. "Tommy asked me about apprenticing," I said finally. "Marco's offered to teach him the old ways just like my father taught me." Michael's head snapped up. "Tommy, but he's supposed to go to business school, learn to manage the empire." "Maybe the empire isn't what he needs. Maybe he needs what you've forgotten. The joy of creating something real with his own hands." I slid a plate of freshly made gnocchi in front of him. Taste. Remember what food was like before it became a business plan. He took a bite, and for a moment, I saw the boy who used to stand on a chair beside me, eager to learn every detail. His eyes closed, and I knew he was tasting not just the pasta, but memories. "It's perfect," he whispered, "like it always was." "No," I corrected. "It's authentic. There's a difference." The turning point came unexpectedly. During a routine health inspection at the flagship Golden Spoon, Michael's new corporate chef failed to properly execute one of my signature dishes. A customer got sick, and the media pounced on the story. Golden Empire tarnished. Quality concerns rise as Family Feud continues. The headline hit Michael where it hurt most, his reputation. All the tube appearances and celebrity status couldn't protect him from the simple truth. The food wasn't the same without the original recipes and techniques. I received a call from Giuseppe, my father's oldest friend and one of the most respected food critics in the city. "Antonio," he said, using my full name like he had when I was learning to cook in his restaurant decades ago, "I'm writing a piece about authentic cooking traditions. Would you talk to me?" We met in his tiny restaurant, unchanged after 40 years. The interview turned into a cooking session, with Giuseppe watching as I prepared the same dishes I'd learned in that very kitchen. "You know," he said, watching me work, "your son makes good television. But you, my friend, you make good food." His article, when it appeared, wasn't just about cooking. It was about legacy, about the difference between innovation and improvement, about the soul of food that can't be mass-produced. The morning it was published, Tommy showed up at my door before school. "Grandpa," I read Mr. Giuseppe's article. "Is it true that great-grandpa's recipes came from his village in Italy?" I pulled out the old leather recipe book. "See these notes in the margins? Your great-grandfather wrote them when he was learning to cook. Each one tells a story." Tommy ran his finger over the faded Italian words. "Dad never told me about this." "Your father was too busy looking forward to remember where he came from." That afternoon, Sarah called with surprising news. Patricia's left Michael. Said she didn't sign up for a failing business empire. I thought about my son, alone in his massive house with his 2 awards and empty kitchen. How's he taking it? Actually, he's in the old Golden Spoon kitchen. Been there since morning, trying to cook the original recipes from memory. I knew what he was feeling, the desperate search for something authentic in a world he'd made artificial. I'd seen it before in young chefs who'd lost their way. Making a decision, I drove to the restaurant. The staff let me in through the back door, just like old times. I found Michael in the main kitchen, surrounded by failed attempts at recreating my seafood risotto. He looked up, face streaked with sweat and frustration. "I can't get it right. I've made this dish thousands of times, but it's not the same. Because you're cooking with your head, not your heart." I removed my jacket and rolled up my sleeves. "Move over." For the next 2 hours, I showed him what he'd forgotten. Not just ingredients and techniques, but the why behind each step. The way to tell when the rice was ready by sound rather than time. The exact moment to add the seafood stock, passed down through 3 generations of our family. "Remember," I said as we worked, "your grandfather used to say cooking is like raising children. You can't rush it, you can't fake it, and you have to pay attention to the small details." Michael was quiet, absorbing each lesson like he had as a child. When we finally plated the risotto, his hands trembled slightly. "Taste," I instructed. He took a bite, and tears formed in his eyes. "It's exactly like I remember. From before everything got so complicated." Nothing complicated about good food, son. Just patience, respect, and love. We sat in the empty restaurant, sharing the dish we'd made together. Finally, Michael spoke. "The board meets tomorrow. They're voting on whether to accept a buyout offer from a restaurant conglomerate." "And what do you want?" He stared at his plate. I'd want my son to be proud of more than just my TV ratings. I want to cook real food again. Then maybe it's time to remember what Golden Spoon was meant to be. The next day, Michael shocked his board by rejecting the buyout offer. Instead, he announced a Return to Roots initiative. The expansion plans were canceled. The corporate chef program was disbanded. "We're going back to basics," he told the press. "Quality over quantity. Tradition over trends." It wasn't easy. Some investors pulled out. Patricia filed for divorce, demanding a share of the company. But slowly, things began to change. Tommy started his apprenticeship with Marco, spending weekends learning the foundations of real cooking. Michael began working in the kitchen again, relearning the skills he'd neglected. One Sunday, 2 months after that fateful dinner where he'd called me a burden, we gathered in my kitchen. 3 generations of cooks making Sunday dinner together. As we worked, I watched Michael teaching Tommy the proper way to knead pasta dough, using the same words my father had used with me. "Feel the dough," he was saying. "It'll tell you when it's ready." Sarah caught my eye and smiled. "Look familiar?" I nodded, remembering countless Sundays in my father's kitchen. "The recipe book stays in the family," I said, "but only for those who understand its real value." Michael looked up. "It was never about the recipes, was it, Dad? It was about remembering who we are." "Exactly, son. Some things can't be franchised, can't be mass-produced. Some things have to be passed down, person to person, heart to heart." Tommy held up his perfectly kneaded dough. "Like this, Dad." Michael checked the texture, using the knowledge passed down through generations. "Perfect, son, just like your grandfather taught me." And in that moment, watching my son and grandson cook together, I knew the real Golden Spoon had nothing to do with restaurants or empires. It was this: the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, seasoned with love and respect. The food empire might have grown smaller, but our family had grown stronger. And that, as my father would have said, was the finest recipe of all. 1 year later, the transformation was complete. The Golden Spoon had returned to its roots, with Michael working alongside the chefs instead of in front of cameras. The satellite restaurants were sold off, except for 2 that Michael kept, running them with the original recipes and standards. The food critics noticed. Giuseppe wrote another piece. The Return of Authenticity. How the Golden Spoon found its soul again. The Michelin inspector paid an unannounced visit, and for the first time in 5 years, we earned back our 2nd star. But the real change was visible in the small moments. Like the morning I walked into the restaurant to find Michael teaching a group of young chefs how to make fresh pasta, using my father's old wooden spoon as he explained the importance of tradition. "My grandfather brought this spoon from Italy," he told them, holding it with reverence. "It's not fancy or expensive, but it carries decades of knowledge in its grain." Tommy, now 14, had become a fixture in both restaurant kitchens. Between his apprenticeship with Marco and the family lessons, he was developing into a remarkable young cook. More importantly, he understood the value of patience and tradition. Patricia's divorce settlement had taken a chunk of the company's value, but Michael seemed happier with less. "Money doesn't taste as good as authenticity," he'd say, echoing my father's words. The regular customers returned, drawn by the honest food and family atmosphere. The dining room was no longer filled with social climbers and food critics, but with people who appreciated real cooking. One evening, as we were closing up, Michael called everyone into the kitchen. The staff gathered around, from the dishwashers to the senior chefs. "I have an announcement," he said, looking nervous but determined. "We've been offered another TV deal. A big one. They want to turn the Golden Spoon into a national brand again." The kitchen fell silent. I felt my heart sink, wondering if we were about to repeat history. But Michael smiled. I turned them down. "Because this," he gestured around the kitchen, "this isn't about fame or fortune. It's about family, about tradition, about doing things right. He reached into his chef's coat and pulled out a worn envelope. Dad, this is for you. Inside was a legal document transferring majority ownership of the Golden Spoon back to me, along with a handwritten note. Asterisk, dear Dad. A burden doesn't build empires. A burden doesn't create recipes that last generations. A burden doesn't teach his son a difference between success and significance. I was wrong about so many things. But thanks to you, I finally got the most important recipe right, the one for living a life of meaning. The restaurant is yours again. I'll be honored to cook alongside you, not as a CEO, but as a son who finally understands his heritage. Love, Michael Asterisk. I looked at my son, seeing not the celebrity chef he'd been, but the man he'd become. No, I said, handing the papers back. Keep it. You've earned it, not through business deals, but by remembering what matters. Tommy stepped forward. Does this mean we'll keep cooking the old recipes, Dad? Michael hugged his son. The old recipes, the old ways, the old values. Some things don't need improving. Later that night, in my kitchen, I added a new page to the family recipe book. Not a recipe for food, but a recipe for legacy. Asterisk, the secret to cooking, as in life, lies not in the ingredients but in the love with which they're combined. Money can buy the finest truffles, but it can't buy the patience to perfect a sauce. Fame can fill a restaurant, but it can't fill a dish with heart. To my son Michael, who learned this lesson the hard way, and to my grandson Tommy, who understood it from the start, our greatest legacy isn't in the recipes themselves, but in the wisdom behind them. Cook with pride, but serve with humility. Learn from the past, but create for the future. And remember, the most important ingredient in any kitchen is family. Asterisk. As I closed the book, I thought about my father's old wooden spoon, still stirring up love in our kitchen after all these years. Some burdens, I realized, are actually blessings in disguise. You just have to have the wisdom to recognize them, and the patience to let them teach you what matters most.